Hello, Comics Alternative fans. Before we start with the episode, we want to invite all of you to check out our Patreon campaign.
That's right. Go to www.patreon.com/comicsalternative for more details. There you'll find more information about the campaign and the cool rewards levels we have.
For as little as $1 a month, you can help us maintain good quality comics talk, and the more you contribute, the more perks you get.
These include monthly podcast episodes exclusive to Patreon supporters, as well as the chance to help us choose which books we review on the show. So be sure to visit www.patreon.com/comicsalternative and become one of our proud podcast patrons.
Yeah, and now on with the show.
This is the Comics Alternative, episode 155. A roundtable discussion for International Podcast Day 2015. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
I'm Gwen.
I'm Andy Wolverton.
I'm Gene.
And I'm Andy Kunka, and we're 5 people with PhDs talking about comics.
And if this sounded like an unusual opening, well, it is. This is the first time we've had more than 3 co-hosts on the Comics Alternative at one time. And the occasion is International Podcast Day. International Podcast Day is Wednesday, September the 30th, and we wanted to celebrate that occasion by getting as many co-hosts of the show on and talking about podcasts. But before we get into that discussion, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, Gene, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering ka-ching needs. There you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. Ka-ching. Other publishers are 20 to 35% off cover price, and every single month you're going to find some incredible, unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials are at 45% off cover price, sometimes they're 50% off, but many times you'll find discounts that go higher than that.
That's right, so check it out.
And we're coming up into the last days of September. In fact, this episode goes up the tail end, the very tail of September, the 30th, International Podcast Day. But it's okay because DCB Service does not mind late orders. So check them out. Go to their website, dcbservice.com. They'll take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, please be sure to drop them a line and tell them that the 5 folks with PhDs sent you. Can I have an amen?
Amen.
Yeah, amen.
Yes.
Yeah. Amen.
Amen.
I think this is really this is really boding well.
Yes,
so far.
It is.
For having 5 people on the show.
It is. And, we've had roundtable discussions before, I think once before, where we had 5 people. So that's always a challenge when you're doing this and, just an audio podcast, because we're using Skype, but we're not using the video component, so we can't see when someone is about to talk. But that's okay. I think we're going to get into the groove of this. And, in fact, it kind of underscores the theme for this show, International Podcast Day, because the very nature of what we're doing now has everything to do with this occasion. Podcasting, what goes into podcasting, and some of the challenges of podcasting. Now, there are 5 of us who are on the show right now. We have 2 other regular co-hosts on the Comics Alternative. There is Sean and Shay. Neither of them were able to join us for today. They're both out of town, but they're here in spirit, if nothing else.
Yes.
So it being International Podcast Day, we're going to be talking specifically about comics. We're going to be discussing podcasting in kind of a broad, general way. and our experiences with it, the kind of things we listen to, and I thought maybe to get the ball rolling, we could each share, if we want, when we first started listening to podcasts and what those podcasts were.
Yeah, I was thinking about that earlier today. This is Gene. Maybe we should introduce ourselves once in a while because there are 5 of us. I was trying to think about this earlier. Like, what was the first podcast I remember listening to? And I can't tell you. I remember one of the first ones I listened to was The Sound of Young America from Jesse Thorne, which was kind of like a pop culture podcast thing. I don't know if anybody else is familiar with that. He's got something else now. I think it's changed names 3 or 4 different times. But I started listening to him because he was interviewing cool people. There were cartoonists, but there were also comedians and actors and actresses and stuff like that, and artists and things. And so that became interesting. And he would have comedy troupes on sometimes like that. But that was maybe 5 or 6 years ago. I've never been a huge podcast person. In the last year, I've become much more so than I ever was. But I'm still not listening to them constantly.
Did that become an NPR show?
It did become at first it was him in his basement or whatever. Then it became an NPR show, and then it's morphed into something else. I think it's called. I'm just trying to look at my things that I've subscribed to right now, and I'm not going to find it immediately enough what it's called anymore. But yeah, for a while it was NPR. Now it's called Bullseye with Jesse Thorne.
That's right, and that is on NPR also.
Okay,
so that was your first exposure to podcasting, Gene.
Let's say that I have. I'm sure it's a lie, but it's a lie that sounds vaguely truthful.
Well, this is Andy Kunka, and I guess my first podcasting experiences were comic podcasts, and I got into specifically John Suntress's Word Balloon. Is that it?
Yes.
And then Around Comics, which I think is defunct now,
it's no longer
I've seen
around.
Right. And they were out of Chicago, and one of the things I really liked about Around Comics was the chemistry and camaraderie between what were the 3 hosts at the time, and they recorded live out of Challengers Comics in Chicago. And they would often have guests that were local Chicago comics people. So that was the first place, for example, that I heard about Tim Seeley's work, and so got to know that through there. And with John Suntress, I think John Suntress just is the gold standard for comics interviews, and that really kind of set the bar for me in terms of listening. Wanting to listen to quality, in-depth interviews with comics creators.
Well, guys, I'll go ahead and say 2 octaves higher than everyone else. I started commuting a few years ago quite regularly, and I started listening to a podcast called Let's Get Busy, which sounds probably more exciting than the reality.
Sounds pretty exciting.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's from a librarian. His name is the Busy Librarian. That's his handle. But his actual name is even more amazing. It's Michael Winner. When your last name is Winner, you don't have to try too hard. He's a school librarian, actually out of Maryland, and he interviews children's literature authors. And he has almost 200 podcasts right now up online on archive on his Let's Get Busy podcast page. And I've been using some of them when I teach. He has one with CC Bell, for instance. So when I teach El Defo, I have my students listen to it. And honestly, I will say my use of podcasts has been driven by my teaching more than anything else, because I find that my students are really willing to listen to things in ways that sometimes they aren't if I were to assign them reading. So that's one way I've been using podcasts. And I've been listening to his podcast for about 2 years now. So,
Gwen, it's interesting that you mentioned him because his name is very familiar to me, being a librarian in Maryland, but I have never listened to that. So, that's so. Now, is that ongoing? Is it still going on?
Yeah, it is. He's still getting busy. So,
is it busy or busy? Please tell me it's busy.
I wish it were. I could feign the accent, but no.
Well, this is Andy Wolverton, and I will say that as my wife will tell you, I was very late into getting into cell phones and cell phone technology, so I was pretty late getting into podcasts. And the first podcast I can remember listening to really isn't a podcast, but it's just a representation or a replaying of a radio show, which one of my favorites has always been Fresh Air on NPR with Terry Gross. So I just started listening to that as a podcast. Again, it's not really a podcast. It's more of a radio show. But that kind of transitioned me into listening to other podcasts. But that was probably the first.
Well, that's interesting, Andy W., because I think that a lot of people probably have a similar experience in that their first podcast is something that I guess technically is a podcast, but I don't consider it the same kind of podcast as what we do and what many other, maybe most other podcasters do, because it has its origins like Fresh Air, and then there's so many other NPR shows. They have their origins as a radio show, so they do have professional quality, professional production. One of the first podcasts I listened to on a regular basis was, and still is occasionally, Sound Opinions, and that is a music-based radio program out of Chicago,
right,
WBEZ. And because we don't carry that in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, I would have to listen to the podcast in order to get my weekly fix of that. And that was several years ago. I think that was back in like 2009. And so that was the first podcast I listened to on a regular basis. And, much like what a couple of you said, it's something like a radio program translated into podcast form, and then we consume it that way. My very first podcasts, though, go back a few years earlier, and I didn't listen to it so much on any kind of mobile device, because I didn't have things like smartphones back in 2007, 2006. But I began listening to They Might Be Giants. They had a couple of podcasts for a while, and I would listen to it through iTunes on my desktop. So they had just a They Might Be Giants podcast, and then there was another one that they started back in 2008 called They Might Be Giants Friday Night Family Podcast, and most of these were video in nature. And then from there I started to explore other podcasts, unsurprisingly, based on They Might Be Giants. There was one called They Now that I used to listen to. I don't know where that's gone now. And then one or two others that deal with They Might Be Giants. And then from there I started to explore other podcasts that dealt with other music, not just They Might Be Giants. I know that the Beach Boys, around the 40th anniversary of their Pet Sounds, had a podcast for a while. The Boxmasters had a podcast for a while. And then there was a podcast based around, I don't know if any of you guys remember this, but it was on, I don't know if it was on Siri. Bob Dylan had Bob Dylan's Theme Time Radio Hour with your host, Bob Dylan.
Yep.
And I used to listen to that, but not on a podcast. But there was a podcast that was based on that called Dreamtime, and I can't remember the guy's name, but he would make comments on the weekly episodes of Theme Time Radio Hour. And so I would listen to that as well. And it wasn't until, I don't know, maybe around 2010 that I started to listen to podcasts about comics. And one of the ones that I listened to, kind of like Andy Kunka, is John Suntress's Word Balloon. But there were a few others that I began to listen to then, probably the most prominent of which is John Mayo's The Comic Book Page, and also Chris Marshall's Collected Comics Library. And then there have been others that I've listened to on and off since then. But those were the podcasts that I began listening to.
Something Gwen said, and then Derek, something you said reminded me too, that I also didn't have the technology to listen to podcasts in my car, though. As Gwen mentioned, she had a commute, and I have an hour commute each way to work, and that's how I started getting into podcasts as well. But I used to burn them to CDs and play them in my car, and that was the only way I could get to listen to them in my car. And so I still have a stack of word balloon episodes on CD. Sometimes I think there's a Kurt Busiek interview that's like 3 CDs.
Wow. So you didn't use rewritable CDs?
I might have. I don't know. I just used whatever I had.
Oh, okay.
I don't know. I don't even know anymore.
So you saved them. It's not as if you recorded them on a rewritable and then once you've listened to them, then you overwrote them.
No, I just let them pile up in my car.
Wow.
And occasionally gets coffee spilled on them.
I'm trying to think of some survival thing that would be useful for, Andy, if you're ever stuck somewhere. Maybe like flares or hell, play out SOS on the roof of your car.
Well, Chuck Klosterman has that thing about when someone asks him what CD would you take to a desert island, he talks about he'd take those Pink Floyd CDs that were pressed in gold so that he could use them to fashion into into arrowheads if he needed to, or trade them with natives or things like that. So CDs could be useful in a variety of ways. I could use them as ice scraper.
When Zach was a baby, we used to use old CDs as toys.
They're shiny.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's something that Zach will be talking to a therapist about someday.
The mirror stage. It's in.
Well, this has led to another topic for us to discuss, and that is how we listen to our podcasts. So, Gwen and Andy, both of you mentioned that you listen to podcasts on your commutes. What about the rest of you? Do you listen to them primarily in the car?
I don't have a car. and my commute to work on the train is only about 7 minutes. So it's not really that useful for podcasts. I'll listen to things like when I'm doing the dishes. I'll fire something up, or mostly it's when I go to bed, and I will, because I like to go to bed listening to voices because it makes dreams interesting. But I listen to a lot of things late at night, sort of, or when I'm taking a break, like on the weekend or something like that.
Yeah, Gene, I kind of do the same thing when I'm doing mundane tasks like washing the dishes, mowing the lawn, walking the dog. Sometimes I'll listen to while I'm running, and sometimes while I'm driving to work, although my drive to work usually is only about 30 minutes. So depending on what type of podcast, I might get halfway through one. If it's one of our podcasts, Derek, that we do at All Press Expo, that'll be about 1/50th of the total time. Just kidding.
I'm working on those right now.
Yeah. Are you on episode 73 right now?
No, I'm in the third hour of you two talking about the difference between anthologies and collections.
Yeah,
I think we could squeeze out a dissertation there between the two. Right?
Yeah, we did generate a lot of content.
By the way, though, I do want to say, since we're talking about our content, our podcast, all of a sudden, that Andy and Gwen, I really, really enjoyed the your addition to the podcast, to the comics alternative world. So
thank you.
Thank you.
It was very professional. It made me feel like you had been prepared, as opposed to, say, what I feel like I do when I'm on the show.
It was a lot of fun, and well, Gwen, we got another one coming up pretty soon.
We do, and it's going to be a lot of fun. I've already read one of the books for it, so see, I've done my homework.
You're ahead of me. That's the professionalism that Andy was talking about.
I see, exactly. No, you guys were having a good time last weekend, so I'm so excited to hear about your experiences and to listen to it on the podcast. So,
well, block out a lot of time.
Yeah,
that's what I understand. It's epic.
It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was, and I want to I guess just say here to what Kunka mentioned about the comics alternative for young readers. I think that not only did you guys do a great job, but I think it hits an area that we really don't cover much. Every now and again, we've talked about comics for younger readers, but usually we frame it in terms of all ages. And it's a rarity that we've looked at something where, let's say, the intended primary audience is younger readers. So I think this is it was much needed, and I'm glad that you guys wanted to go forward with this, because if you had asked me, hey, do you want to co-host this with me? I said, no, there's no way that show will get on the air if I'm going to have to co-host it, because I've just got too much going on. But so I'm also appreciative of the fact that you guys are doing this, just the two of you.
We're glad, too. The children of America are glad.
Yes, they are.
And the gratitude of the children of America is enough for me.
Do we have any patriotic music, Derek, we could play during this segment of the podcast, maybe?
I'm glad you said patriotic music, because as Gwen was saying that, I was thinking of Michael Jackson.
Okay.
Too soon.
Okay. But I do believe that children are our future.
That's Whitney.
That's very Whitney.
I know.
Also
Okay.
too soon.
Yeah. So damn it, both of those examples too soon. Getting back to how we listen to the podcasts, I guess I do something similar to what several of you have mentioned. I listen in the car. I think my commute is anywhere from 25 to 40 minutes, just depending on Dallas traffic. So many times I can listen to a good section of certain podcasts, and depending on how much time I'm going to have on the road, or I anticipate, there's certain podcasts that I'll listen to or won't listen to, because there's some that I can get in smaller chunks, and then there are some that I would just rather listen to for a more sustained period of time. But I also listen to them when I'm walking the dog or jogging in the morning, so I have a lot of podcast listening opportunities. But I still don't get to listen to everything I want to.
There's just too much.
And there is. And my problem is I subscribe to so many things that my mobile device, or my podcatcher, whatever you want to call it, runs out of storage space. So then I have to start, deleting those shows that I ask myself, am I going to go back and listen to something that was like 2 months old? Probably not. But I found that my podcast listening habits have changed over the past 2 years, not so much in terms of when or how I listen, but what I listen to. And so I'm curious if you guys have felt changes of your own, like the kind of podcast that you tend to gravitate toward.
I know that one of the things, and I wanted to ask if you all have the same problem, I'll hear about a podcast from somebody, and it might be on something that I think I'm interested in, and I start listening to it, and the hosts spend 20, 25 minutes talking about how drunk they got the night before, or something that has absolutely nothing to do with the podcast, and it just goes on and on and on. And there might be some good stuff later on in the podcast, but I'm like, yeah, I don't have time for this. I mean, do you ever experience something like that? You're looking forward to it, and it turns out to be just a complete bust?
Yeah, I had several comics podcasts that I thought the premise sounded really good, that they were I'm not going to name any names, but they were creating a show that had a unique potential to it, and then I'd listen to 2 or 3 episodes and have to give up on it. For not so much if they were talking about how much they got drunk, but how
that's research for me.
How kind of little content there was to what they were saying, or how they would often reinforce a lot of the kind of comics reader stereotypes that I don't like.
Yeah, I echo that, and also I've had a similar experience, not so much or not only in terms of content and not being what I thought it would be, but also the quality. There's one that I guess it was earlier this year I discovered, and I thought, okay, it's a relatively new podcast, and I thought that it might be up our alley in that they look at something that's not the mainstream for the most part. the content may have been interesting, but the way that things were recorded, it was just unlistenable. And if they were using mics, it was the mics on their computers, and they must have been sitting on the opposite side of whatever rooms they were in, because it really did sound like a tin can. And I just couldn't listen to it anymore. So it's unfortunate. So, I guess there are any number of reasons why you may start to listen to something and then decide that it's not for you. It could be the quality of the audio. It could be the content. And it could be the personalities of the host or co-hosts. And, to me, that's that topic right there, the co-host or the host, makes a big difference, because I know, Kunka, you turned me on, much to my wife's chagrin, to Gilbert Gottfried's amazing Colossal podcast.
Represent.
If what we hear in Gilbert Gottfried's amazing Colossal podcast was by anyone other than Gilbert Gottfried and his co-host Frank Santopadre, then it may be unlistenable. Because if you sit down and try to figure out what it is that they actually say, there are moments, I think, that you would be stretching it to call it funny. But because of the delivery of Gottfried and Santopadre, I think that it works.
Yeah. There's that last Bob Costas episode. I don't know if you listen to that. It takes Gilbert 20 minutes to try to get out one joke at the end of that podcast, and he has to keep starting it over again, and they're all laughing so hard. But it's, so you describe that to somebody and it sounds like it's a waste of time, but it is hilarious when it's going on.
And that's a good example of what it was pointed out, that if you don't have a buy-in, if you don't enjoy the host or the co-hosts of a show, then it just won't resonate. I mean, if I tried to get my wife to listen to that, she would probably get through 3 or 4 seconds and then turn it off. Just because of the personality.
Yeah, well, Gilbert's an acquired taste. Let's not mince words. But Frank Santopadre is a really good balance for him, I think, because he's kind of he's funny, but he's also kind of no nonsense, and he does tons of research for the people that they have on.
Oh yeah,
I discovered that one with the very first episode, Dick Cavett, which is one of the best interviews I've ever heard in my life, because Dick Cavett is just amazing. Mm-hmm. Still, because he was a great interviewer, but I found out that he's a really great interviewee too. And I heard him tell Groucho stories I've never heard him tell before, and I've heard him tell a lot of Groucho stories over the years. He did love Groucho Marx, but that's one of the podcasts I wanted to mention, that something that I do listen to. The Henry Winkler episode was also really good. I didn't know much about Henry Winkler beforehand, except for Fonzie and Arrested Development and stuff like that. But he was just a really, really fascinating person to listen to. And they're good. Even with Gilbert's kind of wacky persona, they get into some really good kind of meaty questions and really digging into people's lives and stuff. It's not just the superficial stuff, which they can do as well and be really funny at.
Well, with that, what are some other things that you all listen to now regularly?
Well, I can say that I listen to the Guardian children's book podcast. This is put out by the Guardian newspaper. And actually, the reason I like it is in part because some of the hosts are children. And as someone who works with children's lit and talks about it all the time, I actually don't spend a lot of time with children. So there's something sort of refreshing listening to a little kid ask, John Klassen stories, talk about his books or whatever, or David Levithan. And also, I have to say, these kids, they prepare. They are professionals, right? But it's great because they're all British and they have that little cute school accent going, Excuse me, Mr. Levithan, I have a question. So that's really good. And actually, they're quite short, too. They're about 15 minutes, which works out really well in my fast-paced life. So I really love that one. It's a really good podcast. No jokes, but like...
I'll jump on another British one also. I like it's fairly recent. It's called The Illusionist, with an A, not an I. Ooh. She's British, Helen Zaltzman, and it's about kind of like etymologies, word histories, language use. And again, it's about 15 minutes long, which is great because I kind of like shorter ones often. But it's every 2 weeks, and it's really fascinating. She does a lot of research and a lot of interviews with people. It's not just her like reading from the dictionary. It's really, really well thought, and it's a lot of fun. And there are sometimes some jokes.
Awesome. That sounds great.
Yeah. How about a third one from the UK? My favorite one going on right now is one called Attaboy Clarence, and I don't know if anybody knows the significance of that.
Nope.
Well, I do, but
you do because I told you. I told you last week. It's the final line from the movie It's a Wonderful Life.
Oh.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And this is a podcast. It's this guy in the UK, and he does this podcast. Most of the ones I listen to are about movies. It's about classic movies and classic radio. And what he'll usually do, the guy that does it is named Alex. And he's really, really good at it. He's got a great voice. He picks usually a classic movie from the 30s or 40s or 50s, and it's usually a movie that a lot of people have forgotten about. And he goes into a little bit of behind the scenes, and whatever the theme is, whether it's whatever it is, he'll have some movie that he'll talk about, and then he'll also have an old time radio show that has the same theme, or maybe it has the same actor from the movie or something like that. So it's really a lot of fun, and it's the production values on it are very high. I don't know if he cleans up these old radio programs because they sound really, really good. And he's just a really funny guy. So my favorite one is Attaboy Clarence.
Speaking of podcasts about movies, the one that I'm listening to a lot right now, in fact, I just got through going back and listening to all the episodes, but there aren't that many so far, is Out of Theaters. I don't know if any of you know that one.
no.
It's got three hosts, one of whom is the comic book writer Will Pfeiffer, whose work I like a lot anyway, and he's a former movie reviewer as well, and his two co-hosts are former co-workers of his at the newspaper they all used to work at, and they're significantly younger than he is, and so he's trying to introduce them to classic movies, and they're crapping all over him, which is what they say that they're going to do. And so Will really knows his stuff about movies, and I'll often find myself listening to them talk about a movie and wanting them to say something of piece of trivia or something about the movie, and he'll be on it. And then they also have a fun trivia game at the end of the episode where one of the hosts, whoever wins the trivia game gets to pick the next movie, and the main host, Kevin, picks reviews from Amazon reviewers, and they have to guess what movie the review is about.
Oh, nice.
And they're usually, really terrible 1-star reviews, and then gradually they get them. But the kind of joke is that the other that the other host almost never wins. He's only won like once out of all of the episodes they've done, and that Will Pfeiffer can get the answer within one or two clues.
Wow.
That's cool.
Anyway, it's a fun, and one of the things that makes it really good is that the three of them are friends and they have really good chemistry, because otherwise I think listening to a movie about guys in their 20s crapping on classic movies wouldn't be all that interesting, but it's their chemistry that really works and the way they can dig at each other.
That's cool. I just subscribed to it as you were talking about it.
Well, what you said, it really gets back to something that we were mentioning earlier in that, it's the host or the co-hosts that really push or drive the buy-in, because if someone else, as you were pointing out, had been doing that, where you didn't have that kind of interaction among, what is it, the three of them for that podcast, Andy? Yeah, then it wouldn't have the same impact. And so I think when you have two or more people on a particular podcast, it's that interaction. You can kind of sense, are these guys friends, or do they work really well together? As Gene pointed out earlier, that Frank Santopadre, is a great, if we want to call it, straight man, the abbot to Gottfried's Costello. And that's apt because they refer to Abbott and Costello constantly on that show.
Yeah.
It's that kind of interaction, I think, that works really well. The podcasts that I listen to, I kind of group them into different categories. I've already mentioned some of the comics-related podcasts that I listen to. Collected Comics Library, Comic Book Page, and then Comics for Fun and Profit. Sometimes 11 O'Clock Comics. Those are the ones that I'll usually turn to first. Lately, though, there have been other things that have been vying for my attention to where I can't even get to all of the comics podcasts episodes that I like. I've been listening over the past 6 to 8 months to more podcasts about podcasting.
So, now we're getting meta.
Getting meta, yeah. And I do this because of our podcast. Really, I've learned a lot of what to do, what not to do, some of the best practices. One of the first ones that I started listening to, it's well over a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, is the Podcasters Roundtable. And that's a podcast that is co-hosted by 3 people who have their own podcasts about podcasting.
Oh my God.
And so they each have their own shows. Podcaster Studio, The Audacity to Podcast, and The School of Podcasting. And then those 3 guys, Ray Ortega, Daniel J. Lewis, and Dave Jackson, they get together for the Podcasters Roundtable, and then they invite usually 2 new podcasters, people who haven't been on the show before, to fill out the roundtable. But each of those individual podcasts that they have, the Audacity to Podcast, Podcast Studios, Podcaster Studio, and the School of Podcasting, they're all very helpful. They're very different, each in its own way. But I find them very useful, sometimes even getting into the kind of down and dirty technical aspects, which you're going to be able to find more times than not on the Podcaster Studio. And then there are others that I listen to that deal with podcasting, like the Showrunner I've started to listen to the past few months, and those are very helpful. My most recent, I don't know if I want to call it obsession, but I tend to listen to this more than anything now when I'm in the car, and that is Sam Cedars' The Majority Report. I've known about this for a long time, but it's only been within the past couple of months that I've started to listen to it, because I find it entertaining, funny, and also politically, topically oriented, which I really appreciate. And that's one of those podcasts that I can get in a car, even for just a few minutes, catch a few minutes of The Majority Report, and feel okay about it. And, next time I'm in the car, pick up where I left off.
I think you should host a show. You should host a podcast where you review podcasts about podcasts.
Give it time. Give it time. Well, I'm curious if any of you listen to some of those podcasts that tend to get a lot of popular exposure, those that when people hear of podcasting, they're probably going to say, oh, yes, I've heard of that or I've listened to that. And probably one of the best examples there is Serial. And then another one is Mark Maron's WTF.
I actually listened to Serial, Derek, because my wife recommended it to me, and she thought I would like it, and I liked it a lot. I was hooked on it, and then she told me that
Serial?
Serial is a story of a young man in Baltimore who many feel was wrongly accused of a murder back in the 90s, and it's a re-examination of that case with witnesses that were actually there, people that were actually involved, including the man who went to prison. The person that does the podcast actually did phone interviews with him, and we get to hear a lot of those actual recordings. It was a 10-episode podcast, and it really was gripping. It's like watching a really gripping documentary, but of course it's just a podcast. And at the end of it, I won't tell you how it ends because you really should listen to it. It's really good. But there's another offshoot podcast that came after that approaching the same subject but it was with a bunch of lawyers. And my wife liked it just as much as Serial. I was not interested in the second version of it, but I thought Serial was really, really good.
Yeah, I plan on committing a murder so that Serial will have a second season.
But I use Serial as an example because that's one that has really taken off. In fact, if people talk about podcasts that they've listened to, from what I understand, more times than not, Serial is going to be one of the ones they say, "Oh yeah, I've listened to that before," or "I know about that." You know, as opposed to maybe some of the shows that we've been that we've mentioned that we've listened to.
Yeah. I must live under a rock because I've never heard of it before, but I have heard of Mark Maron's WTF, and that's one of those that we were kind of talking about before. I'll listen to it. I'll listen to it when he's interviewing somebody that I'm interested in hearing about.
Yeah.
And I like him as an interviewer, but I generally fast forward through the first 2 to 5 to 8 minutes of the episode because when it's just him talking about his life, I am just not interested for some reason. I think he's a great interviewer, but the first part of the podcast is just always dead for me. So I just kind of pass over it until we get to the actual interviews.
That's interesting because I heard someone just the other day say the exact same thing that you have, Gene, that they don't really like his personal stuff, like what's going on with him and his cats, for instance, before you get to the interview. And, you know, I like the interviews, but I have to say, I feel the opposite about that personal stuff. I really enjoy the very beginning and sometimes the endings of WTF because that's Mark Maron, the comedian that we get. I think the meat of WTF is Mark Maron, the interviewer, and who has really refined his skills over the years, and I enjoy that. But the funny comedian Mark Maron that I knew years ago, I find him in the opening and sometimes, depending on how long it is, the closing part of each of those episodes.
Different strokes.
Different strokes, man. But that's another one that I used to listen to a lot, but now there's just so much competing for my podcast listening attention that I don't get to that one as often as. I mean, I used to listen to all the episodes regardless of who the interview subject was, but now I will be a little more discerning and pick and choose which ones I listen to.
That's how I was with Godfrey's podcast also. For the first 10 or 15, I listened to every single one, and now I'll drop back in once in a while to see if there's somebody that I'm interested in hearing about because there were so many of them.
I often find, though, with that show, it's the ones that I didn't think I would be interested in that turn out to be some of the funniest episodes.
Well, like what, for instance?
Well, the Bob Costas one is, the most recent example. It's not that I'm not interested in Bob Costas. I just didn't think he was all that funny of a guy. And then they that interview turned out to be great. And he had some really interesting stories to tell about when he was doing his own the later talk show, but then also that again that long tasteless joke that ends that episode is just I was crying. I was laughing so hard.
I will definitely be listening to that one. Part of my problem is that I'm just always behind on these things. Like one that I just discovered recently that we talk about things that people talk about a lot. We've been talking about nonfiction the whole time pretty much. Mm-hmm. Welcome to Night Vale. Have people heard of that one?
Yeah.
Oh, my daughter turned me on to it, but I really haven't listened to it other than whenever she's in the car, but I enjoy it.
I was hearing about it for a long time, especially from librarians, and I wasn't sure why. And then about 3 months ago, I figured, well, let's listen to it. And in the past 3 months, I've burned through all 75 half-hour episodes.
Wow.
Which I just never do a thing, but it's nonfiction. It's if you haven't heard it, the conceit is it's this city out west somewhere, probably, and it's like a radio show host giving you the day's news, but the day's news is always bizarre. Like the two most dangerous places in the city of Night Vale are the library and the dog park. Right. You are not allowed to bring your dog to the dog park. But the librarians are all usually armed and usually rabid, And it's really ridiculous, and it's a little over the top, and sometimes it doesn't always work. But I liked it. I liked it a lot, and now I'm finally caught up.
Sounds like my library experience on a day-to-day basis.
It's not all about the library, but whenever they bring up the library, they had tote bags this year for summer reading. It was Catch the Flesh-Eating Reading Virus.
Nice.
Wow.
Yeah, I started on that, and I got pretty far into it, and then kind of lost not really lost interest, but other things got in the way.
Yeah.
Well, that's one I need to listen to more then.
I was just going to say, some of these, listening to some of those podcasts, I liken to watching TV shows. People always ask me, have you watched this TV show? And I'm like, no, I really don't watch much TV because it's such a big commitment. You know, if you have cable or whatever it is that you have, or whether it's streaming, and you've got to watch, 24 episodes or 10 episodes or whatever it is, and that's just a big time commitment to me.
Oh, yeah.
So I usually don't end up listening to, something that's episodic in a podcast. It's usually the nonfiction stuff for me.
For me too, but this one just kind of clicked. But yeah, I don't listen to, I think, any other fiction podcasts. That's the only one.
Mm-hmm. And the thing with Welcome to Night Vale, that it is, even though their individual episodes follow the conceit that you described, there are running gags that you really have to listen to a bunch of them and listen to them really in order to appreciate. Yeah,
and the wacky characters like the faceless old woman who lives in your home, or John Peters, the farmer. That's his name. Every time they introduce it, he's John Peters, the farmer.
Well, what other fiction story-based podcast might you guys listen to? Because that's one of my weak spaces when it comes to podcasts. I'm really not familiar with much of anything there.
And apparently neither are we.
Exactly. From the sound of it.
Bump.
Like I mentioned with Attaboy Clarence, he does a lot of old radio shows, and I like listening to those, things that came out, before I was around. But so many of those, the sound quality is so bad, you can't listen to it. Things like Inner Sanctum or X-1.
Yeah.
Those old radio programs, and you get excited about those, and you listen to them, and the sound quality is so bad, you just can't listen to more than just a few minutes of it.
I think talking about what makes a good podcast and what makes you keep on listening to it, that's led me to think a lot about the podcasts I listen to briefly that involve sports, because I'm a big baseball fan, and there really are a lot of podcasts on baseball. One that I like is called Excessively Wild. And it's pretty cool because it's the same two guys always talking about, they'll do an episode on the worst games of the year. And that's pretty funny. But there's a lot of them where they get into the stats, and it's like they're now just two guys talking without any understanding of audience whatsoever. And that's what can kind of bug me. So when you were talking earlier about chemistry, it's not just the chemistry between the hosts, I think it's understanding that there's an audience out there listening as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it's not just talking to each other, but it's like you need to talk to each other in a way that other people are going to be interested in. It's
right.
Not just not all inside baseball, to coin a phrase.
Yeah.
That's a good point. And, along with that, Gwen, when you were describing this, it reminded me of something else that I wanted to ask you guys, and that is, I guess, the professionalism that goes into the podcasts we listen to and what we may tend to gravitate toward. We were discussing earlier podcasts that are based on traditional or other traditional media like radio, something that is produced by NPR and then they release it as a podcast, versus something like we do. We're not professionals when it comes to radio broadcasting of any sort. We just get together. We're rather informal. I'd like to think we're at least halfway intelligent, if that, or at least we approximate intelligence. Let's say that.
We read good.
We read good. Something that's really polished and professionally produced to the point that it sounds like a radio show. that's for podcast listening, that's a turnoff for me. Not that I don't like it or appreciate it, but my feeling is if it's radio, then I'll turn on the radio. And you can think of it as like a podcast based on an NPR show, as something like DVRing a TV show, right? So you can listen to it whenever you want. There's something really nice about that. But I tend to enjoy those more informal, some people get together to create a podcast and to talk in a way that I find interesting. That kind of unprofessional, informal tone I like more than the polish. Mm-hmm. I mean, do you guys feel the same?
It depends, I suppose, for me. One that I was going to mention that is, I'm guessing you wouldn't like it necessarily. Jessica Abel has a new podcast out on The Wire,
right?
Which is based on her new book,
right,
which is about how to do nonfiction radio, and that includes podcasting. And her main model, obviously, is This American Life.
Oh, yeah,
and her podcast sounds very much, it follows the same kind of formula as This American Life. Very, very polished, musical intros in and out, interludes and things like that. But I like it a lot. And it's a really good companion to the book itself.
Yeah, Gene, I've been listening to that podcast as well, and I really, really enjoy it. And you're right, it does have a very high level of professionalism. And you're right, it does mirror This American Life quite a bit. I think that's going to be a very exciting podcast, and early on, it's already, I think, doing really well.
Yeah, because she mentioned a bit earlier before she even started that she recorded all these interviews when she was researching this book about how to do nonfiction radio. Mm-hmm. And she decided maybe I should put my money where my mouth is and actually just do it myself. But she's also got this kind of like an interactive component where like people who are trying to do their own comics, there's like weekly lessons and things like that. So it's a really, really well thought enterprise.
And in fact, we're going to have Jessica Abel on the podcast to interview her in the coming days. So,
oh, nice.
Yeah, so that's rather apropos. Now, I didn't say I didn't like those shows. It's just that if I'm in a car, if I'm getting ready to go,
is that what you gravitate towards?
Yeah, it's the more personal, informal stuff, and I have nothing against the polish. Although I do think that things that are produced by larger organizations and companies in some form or another, or in a different area when it comes to podcasting. I had an experience where every now and again I will attend the Dallas Podcasters Meetup, and it's fairly well attended. One of my very first and this is basically once a month, podcasters or podcaster wannabes. And sometimes half the meeting is people who are about to or want to start a podcast, but they've not produced the first show yet. But it's where they can get together and listen to how-to presentations, tech information, and just get to know each other, share information. It's very nice. My very first meeting, one of the things they do is at the very beginning, someone volunteers to play a few minutes of their own podcast, and then people in the room get to respond to it. Well,
a critique.
Yes, kind of a group loose critique. And so the very first meeting, it was also the very first meeting of some other guy. He's a professor, and I think he deals with, I don't know if it's music or something dealing with sound. Or maybe it's something in communication. I just barely remember what this guy said. And his comment when they played this, and it was an informal two guys sitting around a cafe once a week talking about this and that, current events, politics or whatnot. His comment was, well, I would fail my students if they came up with something like this because it doesn't grab me and it doesn't have that feel like you would listen to on, let's say, public radio. And my response is, well, then why don't you listen to public radio, instead of a podcast? Because if that's going to be your criteria, I don't know if is necessarily fair because different people listen to different podcasts for a variety of different reasons. So, and I mentioned that because how we produce podcasts, I mean, there's some that I think are very amateurishly recorded and produced, but they don't intend for that to be the case. Hey, if I had all the money in the world, I think we would sound a lot more, or at least I hope we would sound a lot more professionally produced. but I'm okay with what we do right now. But we're not public radio, or we're not any kind of program that has, quite a bit of financial backing and time. In other words, we're not making money on this.
We're not?
or much.
Surprise.
Yes.
Wait a minute.
I'm talking significant money. So, but I'm okay with the professional polish of something, like Out on the Wire, and I think that's great. But it's just not the kind of thing that we do. But that's okay. Again, different podcasts have a different tone to them and a different voice, and it's just finding one for yourself if you're a podcaster, or finding one that you really appreciate or you prefer if you're a listener.
And in some ways, it has to do with subject matter, too. I mean, I think about a lot of the ways that hashtag activists are using not just podcasts, but a lot of other media in order to get information across. And very often, these are not professionals. They're individuals who are very passionate about a topic or an idea. And you get that sense when you're listening to something like that, that it's of the moment. And there's that sort of authenticity, Derek, maybe, that can sometimes get ironed out even in the best meaning sort of produced podcast, one where there's obviously been a lot of thought. I'm thinking of all the NPR podcasts that I listen to, which honestly just sound like collections of things I've listened to on the radio, and they have a very definite format.
Right.
And so that sense of immediacy isn't always there the way it is when you're listening to folks who are talking about very contemporary topics, and you can tell that there's a real passion there. I like that aspect of things.
Also, I guess my expectations just kind of go following what you guys were saying. My expectations are different for a podcast. It's like if it sounds really well produced, that's great. But if it doesn't sound super highly well produced, I'm not expecting that. If it's on NPR, I don't expect it to sound like crap because my membership pays for that. But for a podcast, people are doing this because they want to,
right?
And give me what you got. And if I don't like it, I don't have to listen to it. But I guess I'm a lot more forgiving. Also, when it comes to podcasts, quality is great, but super high fidelity audio and stuff, that's not the first thing I worry about when I think about listening to a podcast either, like you guys were saying.
Yeah, that's a good point. And Gwen, what you said about the immediacy and the authenticity, I think that's a good way of putting it. That's what it comes down to for me and what I like to get out of a podcast. And I know that that's something that Mark Maron points out often, is that he would much rather his podcast and others that he listens to have that kind of authenticity. And so if during his conversation with someone there are a lot of verbal tics, or there are pauses, uncomfortable moments, why edit those out? Because when you edit those out, you edit out the actual voice of him and his guest at the time, and that experience itself. Now, yes, there are certain things that you do need to edit out of podcasting. But, I've gotten to a point where if there are overt parts of our own podcast that are unnecessary, like, for instance, if on a podcast like this, and we've experienced this a few times since we started recording, since there are 5 of us, sometimes all of us will wait for someone else to speak, and so there's going to be a second or two of silence. I'll go back and I'll edit some of those out. Some I may leave in. It all depends. But I don't go through and meticulously clean things up, because I feel that if I do, I would be sanitizing it to a point to where it's not us at all. Or it's not us as we would like to be represented, perhaps. But and as a listener, I kind of like that more personal, informal, immediate aspect of podcasts.
Plus, you're editing like 4 or 5, 12 shows a week. There's no time to do all that either.
This just reminds me of something I was realizing today. I also, in addition to listening to podcasts, I have satellite radio in my car, and I was listening to the PRX channel, which is a different public than the regular national public radio channel. And while I like that they do shorter pieces on there, I was realizing after listening to 3 or 4 of them how pervasive This American Life is in influencing the just the rhythms and the structure and so on of a lot of radio shows now. And it was starting, I was realizing just how artificial that can be. And so almost like it was, again, like it was too polished, and the kind of little asides that the narrator or the reporter would throw in between comments with the interviewers were just like a little too cute. And so, so the idea of the kind of the more improvised and unstructured and of the moment characteristics of podcasts, I was realizing again today that was something that I looked for.
Yeah. And, this gets back to what Gene had pointed out earlier, Jessica Abel's new book, Out on the Wire. I think that's a great book, and I'm really looking forward to talking with her soon. But in going through and reading that book and seeing what they do on shows like Radio Lab, This American Life, Planet Money, all of those, I mean, they're great shows. They're very polished, and all the work that goes into it. There's a part of me that goes, I feel bad reading about that. It's like, oh my God, there's no way in the world that we could ever measure up to anything like that. But then there's another side of me that goes, well, why would I want to? Because we're doing something very different. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, for me, producing these shows, after we record them, I want to try to sound as good as possible. At the same time, I want us to have that kind of amateurish or hobbyist, however you want to describe it, feel to it, that kind of authenticity or intimacy that's there. But it would be nice to sound very polished, but then as Andy points out, you get to a point where it does sound maybe a little too polished, too scripted, and too cute.
We do not want to be too cute. That's dangerous. We are not the Hello Kitty of podcasts. I hope.
Well, Derek, I agree with you in that, and I think back to the podcast that I enjoy most, and they are. It's like you and Andy. We had this discussion at Heroes Con about when you originally had the idea for the Comics Alternative. You just thought it would be two guys sitting around talking about comics just in a very, very loose way. And I think that you guys have done a really good job of maintaining that. It's kind of like eavesdropping on two guys in a room talking about comics. And the podcasts that I enjoy the most are like that. And again, I listen mainly to movie podcasts. There's a really good one called Linoleum Knife that's a review show between these two guys. And it's just like that. It's just like you plop down in a living room and are just listening to this exchange that they have. It's very natural. It's very unscripted. They're both very passionate about movies. And it comes across that way as something that's not polished. It's not slick, but it's authentic. And I think that's something that, Derek, you and Andy and all of us when we're on the podcast strive to do. And it's what I strive to find when I'm listening to something too.
Well, thanks. When earlier in this conversation, I think it was Gene or somebody said something about podcasts that should be aware of their audience and so on. I got a little, I pulled my collar to the side and, because that has always been a thing that I've never, and maybe it's conscious or unconscious, but never been really self-conscious of, and as Andy Wolverton just said, I've always felt like that I'm walking in, I'm having a conversation on the phone with Derek about comics, and it just happens to be that other people might end up listening to it. And so when I listen to the episodes too, it always strikes me as odd when there's music in when you Derek, when you like play the music underneath, like the DCB service announcement and stuff like that. Uh-huh. It almost sounds like we are talking in rhythm to the music, and yet I don't even realize that's there. Or there's the little musical interludes.
Yeah.
when on the Out of Theaters podcast, it seems to me when I listen to that, like they do their little, like they have theme songs for every segment of the show, but it sounds like they're playing the theme songs live while they're recording, but we don't do that. I'm getting off the subject of what I was originally talking about, but anyway, in hearing when the music is playing, it sounds like this sounds so produced. And you and I, were just having a conversation, and somebody went and threw music in here.
Yeah, I do want to give it a little produced sound. I mean, but there are podcasters who prefer to just record something and then immediately upload it to where they don't edit anything down. There's no intro or outro music, and that's fine. I wanted us to have something, and that's where the time consumption comes in when it comes to editing and producing the show after we've recorded it, is with the music and making sure that in certain places, if the music's in the background, it's not too loud. And I do try to pace it depending on how long it takes us to do, let's say, a DCB service sponsor bit or the contact us part at the end of the show, because sometimes we take longer to do that or shorter to do that than we have at other times, and so I have to adjust the music to play in the background accordingly, or to use sometimes different music of different lengths. So, I mean, I wanted to have somewhat of a polish, but not, too slick.
And, Derek, the music being in there is important, I think, for another reason, too. I mean, if somebody is listening to one of the podcasts and you and Kunka or you and I or Gene or Gwen or whoever, if you're talking about 3 books or 4 books, and maybe that listener doesn't want to have any kind of spoilers about that first book, so he's going to skip to the second book, that music is a good cue. And it's a good, even though it's not, you don't have a timing like we're going to talk about book 1 at 0001, we're going to talk about book 2 at 1528 or whatever. The music is a great cue that, okay, now I know they're talking about the next book. So I think that's probably very helpful too.
And it's a kind of break and a pause. And you mentioned the time. Another thing that I've wanted to do, but it's going to be even more time to produce the show, is to go through and put in time tags about, when we discuss this book, it's at this many minutes, this many seconds in. And I haven't gone in to do that yet and then include those on the show notes, maybe someday, because I can see that information being helpful. Because if you're listening on, let's say, a mobile device, and you can look at the show notes that are included in the MP3, and then if you specifically want to hear a review of just, let's say, one of the 3 titles that we're discussing, you can play in your podcatcher, get to that point, and then listen to it. And I think that could be helpful, but that's more work for me to do.
Yeah, and that's what I do with the music. When I hear the music, I know it's time for the next book. I just fast forward till I hear music.
Oh, I'm glad that's helpful then.
Yeah, metadata is great, but it's time consuming.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you guys, we started off talking about the kind of podcasts that we started listening to, the kinds that we now listen to, what we appreciate in terms of the voice, the topic, the tone, all of that. All of us are podcasters, and, with the comics alternative. So has your experience as a podcaster changed in any way your experience as a listener to podcasts?
That's a good question.
I don't have as much patience for some things as I would have probably before. I'm like what we talked about at the top of close to the top of the show. I'm less likely to stick with a podcast and I think this has more to do with the mission statement of the comics alternative. That, Derek, when you and I were originally talking about this, that we wanted to make sure we were doing something different and not something that, there were 20 other podcasts doing on a regular basis. And so when I see that podcast that I think has a potentially unique approach to comics, and I listen to it, and it's more of the same kind of fanboyish stuff that turned me off of other podcasts, I won't stick around to see if it gets better.
Yeah. And with me, I think it's the sound quality as well. If there are certain things that now that I know how to make things better, if I hear it on another podcast, then it bugs me a little bit. I may still listen. I mean, I won't name it, but there's one comics podcast that I do continue to listen to on a regular basis, and I communicate with the guy who actually produces it every now and again. And there are times that I'm listening to it, and his co-host's mic, or maybe his mic, is a little lower than the other conversationalists, I guess. And that bothers me as I'm listening to it. So I'll email this guy and say, why don't you level the sound level? Use Levelator, because that's free, right? You can just download it and use it, and it'll make things a lot easier. And I know that because, Andy, if you remember, after I think it was our very first episode, I didn't even know about Levelator. And then we put our first episode, a Comics Alternative Manifesto, out there, and then a friend of yours, and I can't remember who it was, listened to it and said, you guys, you need to have your volume levels at about the same, because each of you has a different mic sound level. So then he told us about level. Who was it?
That was Matt Wilson, I think.
Matt Wilson.
Of the War Rocket Ajax podcast, which I haven't even mentioned as a podcast I listen to.
Yeah.
Because those guys don't need my help.
But right, yeah, and so knowing that software could help, momentously in terms of listenability, now I've become very attuned to that when I listen to other podcasts. Mm-hmm. And I also, along with that, I mean, I think it's, for those who are interested in podcasts and doing a podcast of your own, it is very important, at least it was important to me, to have other podcasters give you feedback and just to respond to you. I mean, there are a number of people, and Matt Wilson was one early on who helped us with the Comics Alternative, if not with the sound quality, then making suggestions in terms of a format or even just the technical aspects of, where do you go to upload something, or how do you write a particular file, or what would you include in the show notes. And when we first started this, I had no clue. I'd never done anything in terms of a podcast before. I was going to do a video podcast with the Gallery of the Absurd several years ago, and there was even a pilot episode that I created, but I never did anything with it. So when we started the Comics Alternative podcast, I was completely clueless, and I had to rely on the kindness of strangers. And so those guys, I am very thankful to them for them taking the time. Now that there are other podcasters, comics podcasters, that I had emailed and asked for any kind of suggestions or help or just a few moments of their time, they didn't respond to me, and I've held that against them ever since.
Comics Alternative, we hold grudges.
Yes. Two guys with PhDs and grudges talking about comics. And by the way,
that's an interesting note to draw a blank on. About anybody else? Any other grudges out there?
None that I will admit.
Yeah.
When it gets to the grudge stage, it gets done. Call it a day.
Yeah. And then one other question I wanted to ask you guys, and especially Gwen here, because I think you're the newest member of the Comics Alternative team. Do you feel like a media person now as a podcaster?
Wow. Well, in a way, because let me put it this way. You were saying before, has the experience of being a podcaster influenced how you listen to other podcasts? And I've been a podcaster now for exactly maybe 22 days. And I can tell you that I am now much more forgiving of other people's verbal tics and their tendencies to go off on tangents. And I think it's made me a much more self-aware person about how I am presenting myself and the fields I work in. And for that, I think it's a great learning experience. This has been a challenge for me. I think it sounds strange because I teach for a living, and I'm very unself-conscious in the classroom. But this experience has caused me to be much more aware of how I'm coming across to others. And that said, so many people have either called or emailed or sent me, messages about the podcast and how much they liked it and how much they're looking forward to more of them. And they've started to listen to the other podcasts that you guys are doing. And so I feel like I'm part of an awesome family and I'm learning a lot. And so, yes, I feel like I'm a media person now, but one who's very self-conscious. How about that?
I would guess that all of us, to some degree, are self-conscious in what we do. I know that I've become much more aware of my own voice, and Gwen, as you mentioned, verbal tics. I think, I try to combat that, even in the conversations that I have in daily life, having nothing to do with podcasting. And I think that podcasting and listening to myself on podcasts have brought that to the forefront of my attention.
Mm-hmm. Well, I actually read up on verbal tics once I realized that I had them. And because, that I'm an academic. Of course, if I notice something, I don't go and talk to other people. I go find a book, right? But it's clear that my verbal tics were caused more by nervousness. Because I asked my students and they've told me, no, you don't do these things when you're teaching us. So, it's definitely, I'm aware of it as a medium. And so I think it's actually making me probably a better presenter down the road of everything. Who knows?
I've become really self-conscious about my breathing on the podcast, and that's I have yet to figure out how to fix that, because I think there's been some episodes where I've tried holding my breath between speaking, and that doesn't work.
I know one time, Andy, you were listening to a podcast that we had recorded, and you told me afterwards, it's like, my God, why didn't you tell me that I was making that sound? It's like I'm having a heart attack on the air.
Yeah. Well, there was an episode a little while ago where you had to keep stopping and starting over again because you thought there was something wrong with my breathing, but I was actually sitting on a beanbag chair and moving around.
Oh, I remember.
And I didn't even realize somebody was picking that up.
And those are the kind of things that we don't pay attention to as we're doing the podcast, as we're recording things. But then when I'm listening to it later, mixing things, then I hear the various sounds, and at times I do wonder, it's like, what the hell is that that's coming out? And sometimes I can edit it out, but sometimes I can't. But that's
like today. I've got a shiny new microphone, and I was playing with it without realizing it, and so I apologize for this sound that you were probably hearing a little while ago, until I was told, "Don't do that, Gene. That's bad." So Gene will not do that anymore. That's one of those nervous tics that I needed to be more self-conscious of. But it's so shiny.
Don't touch the microphone.
And you do have a nice mic. When I asked a moment ago about, do you guys feel a part of the media? Part of where I was going with that is I think now that we podcast, we have a certain authority that we may not have had before. And even when it comes to very simple things. So, for instance, the fact that we have a podcast and we've been around for a while, I think that more publishers respect us as reviewers and podcasters, and we're more apt to get their attention when it comes to things like interviews or review copies. And then along with that, as Andy Wolverton and I realized last week at SPX, it's no problem to get press passes to go to some of these events. So now on the one hand, it's like, hey, I get to go in for free. Well, yeah, but, you're there as the media. So, I feel that I need to do some of the work that I, should be doing as a podcaster, not just enjoying myself and having fun, but interviewing people and creating content for the show. So, I think that it's becoming more the case that certain businesses and media outlets are seeing podcasters as legitimate journalists, media personnel, reviewers, and what have you. So that's part of the reason why I was asking, do you guys feel a part of kind of a larger media community?
Yeah, I guess I've yet to really leverage the whole media press pass thing. I guess just the gross feelings of inadequacy. But it's This is a lot of fun. And when you asked me, almost 2 years ago now, would you like to be on this podcast? What, really? Oh my God! When you said, "Would you like to be on this podcast?" I was like, I never would have thought of doing something like that before. But sure, I'll give it a try. And I like it a lot. But it's not. It's still. I don't know. I don't feel very media-y.
Well, I find it has been strange at going to conventions and having people recognize us. You know, I mean, last year at HeroesCon we had the booth, so people were coming up to us and saying that they listened to the podcast, and that was really rewarding. But even before that, I think whatever the 1 year was that Derek, you came down for one day for HeroesCon, there was somebody there who asked me to take a picture with them because they were fans of the podcast, and that was weird. But I appreciated that. I shouldn't say that was too weird, but
it was different.
It was weird to be in that level of being a person that someone would want a picture with.
The golden tones of Andrew Kunka.
Well, you know, when we were at SPX last weekend, Andy Wolverton and I, it was one thing to talk with creators and they say, hey, you know, I've listened to your podcast, you know, I have for a while and I really enjoy it. I mean, that's nice to hear. But what I especially appreciated was running into people who, you know, they're guests at the show as well. They don't have the table. They're not the comics artist. And there were several times that someone came up to me and said, oh, so you do the comics alternative. I've been listening to that for a while. And it's similar to the experience that you had, Andy. It's like, you know, the fact that someone that I'm just meeting now who, I mean, I don't know what their relationship is with comics, if they're just a fan or a reader, but they found our show, and so when they see our name and maybe even our icon, they recognize it, and so they say, hey, I listened to your show. I appreciate it. I appreciate that.
And, you know, Derek, I was telling you last week at SPX, 2 years ago or last year when I went and I interviewed just a few people and I mentioned the comics alternative and most of them had not heard of it. A few had. This year, I think every person that I talked to except for one had either said, I know about your podcast or I listened to it. So, you know, in just 1 year's time, that's pretty huge.
We're getting out there.
We are.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And you know, that's what International Podcast Day is about, maybe as a way of wrapping up, and that is to spread the word about podcasting. I know that all of us and many people that we know about podcasts, a variety of different podcasts, how to listen to podcasts, where to find them, but many people don't. So, you know, it being International Podcast Day, September 30th, after you finish listening to this episode, then go out and do a couple of things. Find one new podcast to listen to and see if you like it. And maybe more importantly, introduce someone else to a podcast. It can be the Comics Alternative. We'd appreciate that. But it can be any podcast. Someone who doesn't normally gravitate toward podcasts. So help spread the word. That's what International Podcast Day is all about. Right, guys?
Yeah, I know. I have some stuff to listen to now after talking about this episode.
Yeah, I took some notes for this.
Too.
Yeah, I did too. And so, on the one hand, I like that. On the other hand, I don't have time to listen to the stuff that I subscribe to already. So thanks for the extra added burden, guys. But, you know, if you want a good kind of burden, that is more comics that you can possibly read, then you can't do anything other than go to the website of our sponsor, and that is Discount Comic Book Service. Their website is dcbservice.com. You're going to find tons of comics there with great discounts you will not find anywhere else. So definitely check those guys out. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us. Let us know what you're reading and also what kind of podcast you listen to. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find in the right-hand side of your browser a tab that says Send Voicemail. Click on that, and from the comfort of your own desktop or mobile device, you can send us a voice message from the You can send us a voice message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. It's very simple and easy to use. Or you can pick up the phone and call us that way. Our phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
I guess I'll go.
That's what I was hoping you'd do.
By email. We are two guys at comicsalternative.com, or you can get a hold of us individually. I guess we're going to go around the room with this one. I'm Andy at comicsalternative.com.
I'm Gwen at comicsalternative.com.
I'm Wolverton at comicsalternative.com.
I'm Gene at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com.
Oh, you can follow us on Twitter and find out what we are doing as far as additions to the blog and the podcast. You can find us at the number 2 guys with PhDs.
That's right. You can also find us on Facebook, on Tumblr, on Instagram, on Google+, and on Pinterest. And if you like to consume your media through YouTube, well, we have a YouTube channel, so check us out there as well. You can subscribe to our podcast through iTunes, and when you do, please be sure to leave us a rating and review. You can also stream us on Stitcher. You can review us there as well. You can also find us on TuneIn. And as always, you can find every single one of our episodes, as well as our reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog. And that's on the website, comicsalternative.com.
We rule all the internets.
That's right.
And if you contact us on every one of those media, then I think you're the person who's going to want to pose for a picture with us the next time you see us at a conference. That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah. How about a signed, autographed picture from all of us? Well, we would have to take a picture, I guess, too. That may be hard to do.
Someone needs to draw us. There we go.
Yeah,
all of us. Yeah, and you know,
was there like maybe a party at Purdue at one time that at least Derek, you, and Gwen and I were at simultaneously, where there could be a picture floating around?
Oh boy, I'm sure there was.
We can edit those all in with Andy.
Yeah,
and then
we could Photoshop me and Gene.
Marquette. Or there's a picture at Marquette where I'm standing in the background and Gene and I didn't actually know each other. But
Or even better yet, each of you can send me pictures of yourselves, and I can cut out your heads, and then I can arrange all of our heads in some kind of weird psychotic manner. So, and we can use that as a prize for someone who contacts us on all the media outlets that we just listed. So we do appreciate you listening to the show. This has been a little different. We hope you enjoyed this podcast episode. And until next time, enjoy International Podcast Day. I'm Derek.
I'm Andy.
And I'm Andy.
And I'm Gwen.
And I'm Gene. Thanks for listening.
That's right. Bye-bye.
Bye.